All right. Hi, guys. So our next section is on the industrial age of American history. So we're going to go on. We talked about railroad expansion. We talked about the combining of the two things. So this is just a little bit of a review. But we're on to the railroad barons. So the barons are people who get incredibly wealthy from their whatever their business that they are in. There were two that we're really going to focus on who got very wealthy off of the railroads. The first one is Cornelius Vanderbilt. His empire stretched from New York to the Great Lakes. And the second is James Hill. He built the Northern Line from Minnesota to Washington State. Leland Stanford and Collis Huntington are also famous. They founded the Central Pacific, which connected California to Utah. That's that promontory activity we did yesterday. They were aggressive and competitive, and they followed few rules. We're going to focus more on Vanderbilt later, but they basically were what's called barons or titans of industry, depending on whether you like them or you did not. So we built the railroads, but eventually everybody was building their own size track, and the trains couldn't switch easily between the two, which slowed down the movements of goods. So eventually they began to standardize this movement. Companies decided they needed to only build one size track, which was a standard gauge, 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Then you have George Westinghouse, who developed brakes, which made train travel safer. Believe it or not, there were no brakes on trains before this. Eli Janey, who created the car couplers so that the trains could actually stick together. They could couple together so that workers could link the cars more easily. Gustav Swift created the refrigerated car, so now we could ship meat and perishable goods. And finally, my favorite, because I have been on a Pullman car, which is super cool, George Pullman creates what are called Pullman cars. They are sleeping cars. If you think Harry Potter, that is a very old-fashioned Pullman car that Harry rides to get to Hogwarts. The seats converted to beds for overnight journeys. All right, let's get to some great inventions. So the first invention we're going to talk about is the telegraph, 1844. So pre-Civil War, Samuel Morse created the telegraph. You were able to get messages from thousands of miles away. And then in 1860, they ran miles of wire to the Western Union Telegraph Company, or Western Union, if you've ever seen those commercials. It still exists today. They sent messages in Morse code, which is that like dun 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 dun, okay, that little beep dots and dashes. It was instant communication, so people could order goods, transmit stories from a newspaper, and send personal messages. So there would be somebody listening to all those dots and dashes who knew Morse code, would translate it into letters, put it together, and that was an entire newspaper article. Very complicated, but very quick. In 1866, a man named Cyrus Field lay telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean. And this is the first time that we could talk via Morse code to England and Europe. We come to the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell. He was born in Scotland, moved to the U.S. He studied methods for teaching hearing impaired people to speak. He experimented with sending voices through electrical wires. In 1876, the telephone was invented, and they figured out how it worked by accident. By 1877, he formed Bell Telephone, and businesses were the first to adopt the technology. So we went from the telegraph to the telephone. Between 1860 and 1894, 100,000 patents were issued. You've got the typewriter, you've got the adding machine, which is the precursor to the calculator, which is the precursor to the computer. You've got George Eastman with his Kodak camera, cheaper and easier to take photographs. And you've got Thurman, who created the vacuum cleaner in 1899. Now let's get to Thomas Edison. He was called the Wizard of Menlo Park. He had a hard time in school because he was actually almost completely deaf. So he was educated mainly at home. He was interested in science and chemistry. By age 12, he had learned how to use the telegraph, and he invented a gadget that could send automatic signals so that he could sleep on the job. In 1876, he set up workshop as an inventor. Now, one thing about Thomas Edison was he actually was better at taking patents that were already created by other scientists and then filing his own patent of his own version. So he actually gets accused of stealing a lot of ideas. Some of the things he gets credit for inventing actually had been invented already, but he took it, modified it, put his own patent out, and then he gets credit. So some of the things he gets credit for are a phonograph, movie projector, telephone transmitter, a battery, and the electric light bulb. Although there's some discrepancy as to whether Tesla got there first or he got there first. So by Christmas of 1880, he used 40 light bulbs to light Menlo Park, and people came from all over to see it, and this was called the Light of the Future. By 1882, there was the first central electric power plant in New York City. We went from gas bulbs that were lit and had flames in them, so you had to have children being lamplighters and lighting the lamps at night, which was a very dangerous job because you could catch on fire, to electricity, and he was illuminating 85 buildings. Then you come to George Westinghouse, 1885. He built transformers to move electric power farther and for cheaper. He also created a method for moving natural gas. Let's talk about some African American inventors during this time. We have Lewis Howard Latimer. He improved the wire for the light bulb. Granville Woods created the electric incubators, so for eggs, so you could hatch chickens electronically without the mother hen. Electromagnetic brakes for the railroads and circuit breakers for the railroads. Elijah McCoy came up with a mechanism for oiling machinery. And Jan Matzlinger was created a shoemaking machine, and so that you could create shoes, not by hand, but by machine. All right, we get to Henry Ford, and arguably the most famous invention of all time. We know he's known for his cars. I really want to talk more about his assembly line. So once Ford creates his assembly line, this allows for technology to just explode because it's faster. Each worker performed their own task over and over and over again. So instead of having one worker make the car from start to finish, like it was in the past, that worker may only work on the light for the car, the headlight. That is it. That produced goods more quickly, leading to mass production. It decreased manufacturing costs, and products could be sold at a lower price. When products are sold at a lower price, middle-class families can afford them. Lower-class families can afford them. Once this happens, everybody can afford things like a car or telephones, and it makes for everybody to have a little bit of equality, so the wealthy don't have all these great things while the middle and lower classes have nothing. They could afford more. All right, so we come to the selling of goods. There was home delivery of mail. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, Sears company comes during this time. They had a mail-in catalog. You could literally order a house. They would ship you the entire house. You could pick your house. There's a lot of great houses all across America that were built during this time. They're called craftsman homes. And you could order your house and you would be responsible for putting it together with directions. But you could order this out of the Sears Roebuck catalog. Eventually, chain stores develop. Kmart, Woolworth, Walmart actually started during this time. And so you begin to see these large box stores where you can start to find everything you need. All right, so that's our stuff for today.